You had you had Yemenis from southwest Arabia establishing themselves in significant numbers in the Indonesian archipelago. In other words, everyone was everywhere until the coming of the Portuguese. Now remember, because sailing distances could be calculated in advance, it took Vasco da Gama only 23 days to sail from East Africa to the southwest coast of India. Anyone in this audience who's a recreational sailor knows what an incredible feat that is, crossing thousands of miles of ocean. Now, before the coming of the Portuguese, you had a very well-established trading system. That brought people all the way from the Middle East to archipelagic Indonesia up to the west coast of China. You had a Hindu cosmopolis from the Indian subcontinent into the South China Sea. You had many different nodes of interaction. And Islam, which in the West is seen as a desert religion, supposedly prone to the extremities of thought to which deserts give rise, was in this part of the world a seafaring faith that was spread over the longitudes, over the chasm of the centuries, by the most sophisticated people in their culture, merchants, cosmopolitan merchants, who brought Islam to what is today archipelagic Indonesia, the southern Philippines, the Malay Peninsula, northwest Burma, etc. And so Islam became a very sophisticated seafaring faith with a very different personality than it had in the Middle East because of geography. And because when Islam came to this part of the world, it was overlaid with an already existent and rich Javanese culture. Now, the reason I bring all this in a futurology conference is because this is the world we are going back to in the 21st century. We're going back to a trading system that will be dominated by the indigenous Eurasian countries themselves, because we had a 500-year interregnum that began with the Portuguese, that continued with the Dutch and the French in the very southern part of the Indian subcontinent, gave way to the British, and eventually to the United States in the form of the U.S. Navy and Air Force after World War II. But what's been happening slowly behind the headlines is that the United States Navy is plateauing. It was 600 warships during the age of high Reaganism in the 1980s. It went down to about 330 warships during the Clinton era. We now have 286 warships. And while the number may bump up to 313 with the advent of the littoral combat ship, in fact, in the 2020s and the 2030s, the United States Navy will probably decline to about 250 warships because of budget problems, the cost overruns, problems with the procurement process, etc. And as the United States Navy plateaus and ultimately starts very gradually to get smaller, it's not just the Chinese Navy, but the navies of India, Southeast Asia, and others that are growing in size. China has a shop-till-you-drop policy towards the acquisition of nuclear and the quietest, best diesel-electric submarines. Forget about the aircraft carrier the Chinese are building. That's not significant. An aircraft carrier is a statement that we've arrived as a great carrier, as a great power. It's the submarines, the anti-access ballistic missiles, the fighter jets, and the other things that are going on that China is acquiring that are much, much more important. Japan supposedly quasi-pacifistic Japan that gives only 1.5% of its GDP to the military, that now has 4 times as many warships as the British Royal Navy. India is going from the 5th largest navy in the world to the 3rd. Vietnam just acquired 6 state-of-the-art Kilo-class submarines. Malaysia has built a submarine port on the island of Borneo. Indonesia is thinking of ways to modernize and increase the size of its navy. And one of the reasons I'm emphasizing maritime in this discussion of the future is because even in a jet and information age, 90% of all commercial goods that travel intercontinentally do so by sea. So while we've just had 10 years of headlines of dirty, messy land wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the future is naval. And by naval, I don't just mean navies. I mean air forces, cyber warfare capacity, and satellites in space, because they all come together. Warships now, since the advent of the aircraft carrier in the early 20th century, air and sea power cannot be disaggregated, and because warships now require information and nautical direction from satellites, it all comes together. And what's been going on in Asia is we're no longer in the age of low-tech ground forces that were messily involved in their country's domestic politics, like Indonesia was under the Sukarno and Suharto era, and like other countries in the region were. We're seeing the rise of real honest-to-goodness post-industrial civilian military complexes. Military power is moving from Europe, from one end of Eurasia, to what I call the Indo-Pacific, the other end of Eurasia. And as this is happening, we've already experienced a multipolar world in terms of diplomacy and economics, but we're entering a multipolar world in terms of military activity as well. The last 30 years, we've had a relatively benign climate of conflict and competition in this part of the world. You had a rising China economically, which allowed countries all over Southeast Asia to increase their own economies by trading with China and raise their own standards of living, even as the United States Navy and Air Force was essentially the unipolar military power in the region. So because of U.S. military power and a rising China, there was a benign security environment for the development of Asian economies. But this era is ending, and it's becoming much more complex. In a more multipolar military power arrangement, it will become much more, or at least measurably more, unstable. So my advice to Indonesia is think in terms of developing a bigger, stronger navy and air force to protect your fisheries, your oil, your natural gas, etc. Now, as Western power in the form of the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, the British, and the Americans starts slowly, gradually to ebb, you have the rise of 2 main indigenous powers in the Indo-Pacific, China and Bangladesh and southern Nepal, required shadow zones of influence in the Middle East and Central Asia and in Southeast Asia. In other words, a greater India from the Iranian plateau to the Gulf of Siam. And in the consequence of expanding their areas of power, of influence, China and India are butting against each other. The Chinese-Indian rivalry is not a rivalry made of historical hatreds, by no means. Buddhism spread from India to China. Because of the wall of the Himalayas, India and China had relatively little to do with each other throughout much of history. What is driving this new rivalry is the collapse of distance through the